What are Souls games really about? Or a better question is, what's the difficulty supposed to teach us? What is really the lesson in these games? And are these games difficult? Many people would argue that Souls games are often not difficult. They're simply challenging, and you have to sort of learn the mechanics and then apply that information. I actually think that gets into a bit of a semantics debate that's unhelpful, but I do think there's an article I want to look at in a moment about, games learning the wrong lessons from Dark Souls. And I want to talk a little bit before we get into that about true difficulty, or actually what is fake difficulty. Oftentimes myself and other people will get a little bit critical of a fight or irritated and say, well, that's just fake difficulty or false difficulty. And I believe that can show up in a variety of ways. And one of the things the article is going to touch on is how, if all you really think a Souls game is a game that's brutal and beats the tar out of you, you might take the wrong lessons, and when you go to design your own game, think, oh, well, this is like a Souls game, right? We made it incredibly difficult. Well, false difficulty can show up in a variety of ways, and one of the ways I think it can show up is sort of an arbitrary stat raise, where suddenly the enemy is just way stronger. No explanation. The mechanics don't really change. There's no newer necessary degree of intelligence from the player or finesse a mechanic. It's just, this enemy's hitting way harder now, or he has way more health. Now, typically when you roll over into New Game Plus, these are mechanics or things that you're accepting going in, but you're also going in with way more knowledge, maybe way more power. So that in those situations would not necessarily be false difficulty. Now, the other way false difficulty can show up, I think, is bad technical or broken mechanics, things that aren't working all that well. If the camera freaks out, if the movement isn't quite working well, if inputs get dropped, or if the player animations or the enemy's animations sort of don't work in the appropriate ways. Maybe iframes fail. Iframes are invincibility frames, sort of when you're rolling or doing something where you're not supposed to take damage. That can result in false difficulty, or attacks that feel automatic, almost like you cannot mitigate or get away from the damage. Now, oftentimes, the lack of information is why somebody might think, oh, that fight is false difficulty. Maybe you're missing the sound cues or the visual cues. This is something that was really difficult for me when I first started getting into Souls games, because I kept thinking, there's no way I can get away from that attack. That seems like automatic damage is a term that I would use. I'm like, this seems kind of automatic. That would be a form of false difficulty, but most of the time it was simply me misunderstanding the mechanics. I wasn't understanding what was going on. And that's related to another element of false difficulty. There might be hidden or withheld information. They don't really let you know how something works, or they kind of keep it hidden from you. Maybe they surprise you. I would say that's a form of false difficulty. Now, sometimes as you go through the fight, there's new mechanics, there's new phases, and you have to kind of pay attention. But sometimes there are mechanics or things that don't have any explanation. You have to go look it up. You have to go read, somewhere outside of the game. I would consider that to be a degree of false difficulty. Somebody might say, well, you're supposed to experiment, you're supposed to do trial and error, or you literally learn by dying, right? You can't survive this. You're going to die the first time, and then you learn, and then you can come back. I would say that's false difficulty. It's mainly just teaching you a lesson through unstoppable pain or an unstoppable death. I wouldn't consider that to be true difficulty. Once you're sort of through that phase, obviously then it is difficult, and you can figure it out. And then I would also say another form of false difficulty is rule breaking. If an enemy sort of establishes the rules of the fight, rhythms, iframes, damage output, animations, things of this nature, and then they break those rules. All of a sudden they cancel out of a flurry or something, and they're not really supposed to be able to do that. That would be another, I think, form of false difficulty, because you can only go based on the information in front of you, and if that information is being misrepresented, that would be, I think, another form of false difficulty. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this is, a lot of the times in the difficulty discussion, there are people sort of demanding or insisting that difficulty settings be put into the game. And a lot of the times I think their take is, all of this is false difficulty. You just made the game hard for the sake of making it hard, and it's inaccessible to other players. It's inaccessible to people, that can't, play games that are that difficult. And I support either decision. If the artist doesn't want to put difficulty settings into their game, or if they do decide to put it into their game, I'm totally fine with that. We got into a debate recently about, different mechanics getting added to Armored Core 6, repair kits, and everybody's upset. They're like, well, that wasn't in the previous games. It's going to make it a lot easier. Listen, if the game developer wants to put that in their game, I respect that decision. That's their choice. And a lot of the times there's going to be reasons behind that. Like they did this on purpose. They anticipate certain things happening that maybe you don't know about, and that's why they're equipping you with certain things. But I also support an artist's decision to say no. We do not want difficulty settings in our game. You're not entitled to play every game that is out there. There is no impetus. There's no imperative on developers to put those difficulty settings in there. And I don't want to retread all the ground about the accessibility debate with respect to colorblind mode or folks who are motor impaired and need special binding and controls and things so they can play. That's not even in the same category as difficulty settings. I'm kind of tired of having to draw that distinction because I just think it's such a bad argument. But I wanted to look at this article from CBR.com because I thought it was interesting. It says, games keep learning the wrong lesson from Dark Souls. And it says Dark Souls is, and its antecedent, Demon Souls, changed the gaming industry, but some of its imitators came away with the wrong lesson. Now, I will say, I've played Souls games before, and I get irritated with the lack of information. I think there is something winsome and clever about how mysterious the Souls games set everything up. You just kind of have to explore and figure things out, and sometimes you get your head taken off. I have played other games that they just don't give you any information, and it can be very frustrating. It's like, just tell me where to go. I'm okay with the combat being difficult. I'm okay with having to sort of learn the rhythms. But the lack of information, I think, can sometimes be done to a fault. It's okay to be mysterious. It's okay to sort of leave breadcrumbs, but to literally leave the player in the dark, I think, is oftentimes an exaggerated interpretation of what Souls games can be known for. I don't know if they're going to touch on that in this article. I can't actually remember. I read it once and thought, I need to do a video on this. I liked this. So, FromSoftware's Dark Souls is well known within the video game industry and has cultivated a following and legacy that continues to have influence 12 years after its initial release. Games like Neo and the upcoming Lies of P wear this influence on their blood-soaked sleeves and are entries into the emerging Souls-like genre. At this point in 2023, the list of games in this genre has grown considerably. However, despite bringing some interesting new ideas to the formula, none have managed to break into the public consciousness past their launch window like Dark Souls or even Demon Souls has. Now, I don't know if I necessarily agree with this. I mean, I'm going to invoke titles that are from software, like Elden Ring. I believe that has really broke into public consciousness. I believe Sekiro did as well. Both of those titles won Game of the Year. But I gather what they're saying. I think what they're saying is that the other titles, the titles that are not from software, haven't necessarily done that. I really enjoyed Timesia. I wish I would have had more time to give to it. I'm hoping that Lies of P can really polish itself up. I thought the demo was great, but there were some wonky issues that are going to need to be polished. You cannot have a game with brutal and punishing combat that is lacking in polish. That is just not going to fly in the community, and even outside of the community. Nobody's going to want to play a really brutally hard game if things aren't quite working right with respect to like dodging and stuff. So hopefully they can work that out, because I love the art style. I love the concept of Lies of P. And I actually think Lies of P is going to be one of the more memorable games. And I think Lords of the Fallen this year is a potential contender for Game of the Year. Everybody keeps thinking that I'm crazy for saying that, but I think there's something special about that game. It's not quite here yet, but everything I see, it's looking very, very promising. I think both these games, Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen, have a chance to make their mark on the genre. It says here that Souls-likes are typically defined as third-person action RPGs that involve stamina management, limited heals between checkpoints that respawn enemies, and tense, difficult combat in a world that time has forgotten. There is one key difference between this formula and what really makes FromSoft Souls-like special: difficulty. So they're saying the difference between this formula and what makes the Souls-likes that are from FromSoft so special is the difficulty. And so that's why I wanted to start by just talking about difficulty. It's a common discussion and debate. I wanted to get some of that out of the way. Like, difficulty settings don't need to be added. I respect it if they do, but I also think there are implementations of difficulty that can be forms of false difficulty, and Souls-like doesn't necessarily fall into that category when it comes from Software. Now, Dark Souls is punishing, not difficult. This is where I find this to be an interesting dichotomy that they're drawing, right? It's punishing, but it's not difficult. I feel like you're playing semantics. Let's see what they have to say. The tagline for Dark Souls was "Prepare to Die," a slogan that was even incorporated into the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, titled the Prepare to Die Edition. This catchy phrase, combined with a vocal segment of the fan base telling everyone to get good, caused the perception of Dark Souls to shift from a game with little hand-holding that encouraged exploration and experimentation to one that was only for the, quote, hardcore gamer. This sentiment then leaked out and grew roots in Souls-likes like Lords of the Fallen and Neo. However, in reality, Dark Souls isn't interested in being, quote, hardcore. It would rather provide a player with many options to move forward, some of which might end in failure. I don't know if I accept this. Like, I don't think they're making necessarily a wrong or a bad point, but I definitely think when you make a game that is poised to be extremely punishing and you only really get through it if you experiment and have endurance, okay, that's going to be something that's kind of hardcore, right? Like, somebody that pushes through large amounts of failure, high amounts of punishment, would be somebody I would consider to be kind of a hardcore player, ergo, it's kind of a hardcore game. So let's continue reading. Other Souls-likes often miss that the difficulty of Dark Souls combat wasn't the goal. Victory over immense adversity was. Okay, I want to reread this because I'm trying to grapple with exactly what they're saying here. So they're saying here is the goal of Dark Souls combat wasn't difficulty. Victory over immense adversity was. But I don't think you can have this. I don't think you can have victory over immense adversity. Like, you're just saying difficulty in another way, right? This is a synonym of difficulty, adversity, right? So I would say that yes, what you're supposed to really come away with from a Souls game is not that it was difficult, but that you overcame the adversity, right? You figured it out, right? Difficulty can be a tool to accomplish this feeling, but it was rarely employed in Demon Souls or Dark Souls outside of endgame or postgame endgame content, where the player character is the top limit of their power arc. Again, I just think this is a little bit of a semantics game where you're going to claim that, you know, difficulty can be a tool, but it really wasn't employed in these games. I don't know what you mean. I mean, they're very difficult. They're challenging. You're overcoming adversity, right? No matter what words you want to, you know, slide in there, you're ultimately talking about difficulty. From Software accomplishes the feeling of immense adversity by obfuscating certain mechanics and letting players explore areas they're not prepared for yet. Now, this is one area where I think you can get into false difficulty. Remember when we started, I said hidden or withheld information can be a form of false difficulty. That doesn't mean that once you know the information, the fight is a sense of false difficulty. But when that pain and that punishment lands on you and you die, and you didn't have that information ahead of time, or you didn't have time to react, I would say, oh, come on, that's kind of false difficulty. And some of that appeal is why people love these games. They learn everything. They know every trap, every nook, every cranny. They can do a no-hit run, right? Well, the only way they did that was because the obfuscating of certain mechanics and hiding things and keeping things withheld from you, well, now they know it all. And that's, like, for them, a moment of pride. And I can appreciate and respect that. As long as a game doesn't do that too much, I can get over that. I don't really have this big frustration with it. But I have this weird thing, and you might be like me. But when I play a Souls game, I take a certain amount of pride in trying to beat the boss the first time. And I know that's a stupid ambition to have because it's pretty unlikely when you're playing Elden Ring or Sekiro or Dark Souls 3. Those are the three that I have played. It's unlikely that I'm going to beat him the first time. Now, there were a couple times that I managed to pull that off. I believe Sekiro was where I had the best track record of winning first try because I kind of just got good at certain things and could certain bosses kind of measure what was required of me. But then, if you die to that unforeseen mechanic, it can be uniquely frustrating, especially if you think, oh, I'm going to get this my first try. I remember the first time Madame Butterfly came back to life. I was like, oh, I'm done, I'm so mad, right? They withheld that information. So I think there are times where it's okay, but there are times where it can be uniquely frustrating, especially if you're really challenging yourself to beat something, your first try. The skeleton-ridden graveyard behind Firelink's shrine in the first Dark Souls is the perfect example of this. It's the first area players can reasonably explore, and it's filled with treasure. However, the enemies there cause status effects that can stop a player's progress before it's ever begun. Once a player understands the enemies and how dodge rolling works with invincibility frames, the skeletons become little more than speed bumps on the way to more powerful weapons and items. The skeletons are less of a difficulty wall and more of a chance for the player to fail. I get what they're doing, like framing it that way, but you're still not necessarily removing the difficulty. Like, just because I learn something and can then overcome it doesn't mean it wasn't difficult. I remember explaining this all the time to people in like raids and stuff. It's like, just because you know how to do this doesn't mean it isn't at its core difficult. Just because you learned to play a really difficult piece on the piano doesn't mean it's no longer difficult now that you just know how to do it, right? Certain things in life, when you first try to do them, riding a bike, okay? my son just had a spill tonight on his bike. It's fresh on my mind, right? It's difficult. You gotta do a lot at the same time. You're trying to balance. You're trying not to fall and bust your head, okay? Just because you figure it out doesn't mean it wasn't difficult. Doesn't mean it isn't at some level inherently difficult. The knowledge that you now have has simply minimized the difficulty. That's how I would phrase it. So let's keep reading. Dark Souls wants players to win. That's the next segment here. Contrary to popular belief, each entry in the Dark Souls series wants its audience to see the end of the story. The myriad of weapons and spells at the player's disposal serves to make sure that every player finds their way through the intimidating obstacles that await them. Cooperation with other players, online or NPCs, in the game itself are available to help with boss fights or particularly troublesome areas. Now you notice they keep trying to avoid using the word difficult. They're like, oh, it's a particularly it's troublesome. there's extra adversity there. Enemies that aren't mini bosses stagger easily and have little in the way of health and resistance. They aren't there to waylay the player's progress, but rather to provide them with the game's experience and currency should they need it. Yeah, I mean, in general, I remember the first couple times I got into these games and you get comfortable in an area, maybe even feel like you can kind of farm the area. And I again think that knowledge minimizing the difficulty for the person is a contextual thing. It doesn't eradicate or remove the difficulty. Again, to use some analogies, right? There's really difficult moves in sports. And you might say, oh, well, that difficulty never really goes away. Well, to some people, the difficulty has been minimized because they've spent their life pole vaulting, for example. If I tried to pole vault, I'd probably kill myself by accident, right? I'd break my neck. But it's less difficult to the person who has gotten really good at it. They've trained, they've conditioned their body, they know all the techniques. So I would say that the difficulty is still present. You have merely minimized it with your knowledge and your practice and your finesse and your experience. Enemies in Dark Souls also serve as low-consequence environment to learn how to manage stamina in combat. Souls-likes too often use their base-level enemies as proof that they aren't afraid to be difficult, throwing damage sponges that can drain a player's health bar in 1 or 2 hits before the mechanics can be thoroughly explored. Now, this is an area where I do agree with them. If you do too much damage too quickly, the player doesn't learn anything, right? If it's just immediate death. So I do think there are times where Souls-likes can, again, they're sort of misinterpreting what the game is supposed to do. There is meant to be, as the author has said, there's meant to be an area or an element of punishment. That punishment is a delivery of information. It's hard to receive the information because you're frustrated, you're angry, you got taken by surprise or whatever. So if you overreach in the punishment, there's no lesson learned. You've just frustrated the player. They don't even understand what's going on. And I felt like the Lords of the Fallen onboarding discussion that they had for their game coming this year, how they're going to have sort of an entrance area, so you get a good grasp and understanding of the game, because they essentially said that's kind of the bridge. The bridge between, sort of overcoming something that's challenging and just getting frustrated, the bridge between the two is understanding. When you understand a fight and it clicks, something changes in you. You're like, I've got this. I'm going to beat this guy. I'm going to beat this monster or whatever, because now you have understanding. And I do agree with them here. If you do this 2-hit kill thing and the mechanics haven't even been thoroughly explored, if I'm dead before I have a chance to blink, well, then now you've made me unable to properly sort of understand what's happening. And the more my understanding is sort of denied me, well, then I can't build that bridge to get across to say, okay, now I can overcome this. However, they say, wait, hang on, I went too far. From Software uses character death to allow for a unique style of iterative play. However, if that loop is too short because enemies are overtuned or weapons don't put out enough damage to make meaningful progress, it defeats the purpose of the loop in the first place. Now, we touched on this, right? Enemies being overtuned. Remember in False Difficulty, I gave an example. I said arbitrary stat raise. So that can be the enemy's just putting out such an obscene amount of damage, or you're putting out so little damage, you're barely moving their health bar, right? That kind of an arbitrary stat raise, I would couch that as like, that's false difficulty. You're just making it overly difficult to where that you feel like you're straining at a gnat just to get the health bar to move, just to get through the fight. So I definitely agree here. There's two extremes. The loop could be too short because they do so much damage to you. Conversely, the fight could be way too long because you do such little damage to them. And they talk about here, like, you're not putting out enough damage. I think those two extremes are great examples of almost like ditches to fall into. You have to avoid fights that are just going to take way too long because, again, you've just done this arbitrary stat raise. Like the enemy just has way too much health, or the enemy does way too much damage, and now the loop, the fight, is way too short. I think this is well stated by the author. I really like that. I really like that spectrum and way to picture it. Dark Souls is still fondly remembered today because it presented a world that was interesting and felt dangerous to explore, but provided the tools to do so for those willing to look. The best Souls-likes try something unique while not giving up what made the From Software game so popular to begin with. Hollow Knight, here we go, Hollow Knight's getting mentioned. Hollow Knight is a great example of a game that has successfully made a name for itself by combining the exploration of the world and mechanics of a Souls game with the ability-based lock and key system of a Metroidvania. I never really considered this. I didn't. I never considered the fact that Hollow Knight does implement Souls game things. I've always just thought of Hollow Knight as a Metroidvania. It's one of my favorite games. I love Ori and the Blind Forest. I always recommend people to play Ori and the Blind Forest, then Hollow Knight, then Ori and the Will of the Wisps, because you can see how much Hollow Knight actually influenced Ori, the second iteration of Ori. Really waiting on Silksong. Hopefully that game's amazing. We've heard from one of the guys working on it that it's now quite big. So I never considered that, though. That's interesting. That makes me really want to see how much more they sort of have evolved Hollow Knight in the next game. Most importantly, it's understood that what made Dark Souls memorable and satisfying wasn't its difficulty. It was the freedom of play and the sense of discovery it offered the player. So they're basically saying, listen, as they said at the top, right? They're saying that the lesson, everybody's learning the wrong lesson, and that's just make it difficult, beat the tar out of the player. That's not really the point. And hopefully Lords of the Fallen, Lies of P, and other Souls-like games on the horizon can, I think, take what is said here to heart. I think they were a little too rigid in their sort of like, oh, well, Souls isn't really difficult. It's troublesome. It's overcoming adversity. No, difficulty is a huge aspect, and the knowledge to overcome that difficulty is key to what's so enjoyable about a good Souls-like game. That, I think, is the lesson. If I'm making a Souls-like game, you got to have all those things in balance. Adequate information, fair attacks or fair mechanics that work well. The player has enough time to gather the information and adapt. You're not just killing them in 2 hits. You're not having a fight that's elongated or fighting for like 45 minutes with a toothpick, right? Now, they might inflict that on themselves, and that's fine, but the game's base level design and equipping the player shouldn't be doing that. I would consider that to be false difficulty. So I would love to know what you think. This is one of the videos that's going live while I'm out of town. It's kind of premiering in the morning. I know you guys are probably missing the live shows. I made these to be a little bit more long-form discussion so that you could share your thoughts in the chat, but make sure you leave a comment below. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. If you want to keep in touch with me while I'm gone, the best way to do that is through our members-only Discord. So make sure you're a member, hit join, become a member. If you don't want to do a membership to get into the extra content in the Discord, hit subscribe, hit the bell button, and I'll see you in the next video.